วันฟ้าเป็นสีครามเต็มไปด้วยขวากน้ำขวางทางมากมายเปลี่ยนคำทักทายให้เป็นท้าทายเปลี่ยนให้เป็นแรงหมุนโลกได้
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to thank you all for making it to Digital Asia Hub's Thailand launch workshop in collaboration with the Electronic Transactions Development Agency, or ETDA, and the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Before we begin our ceremony, the executive directors of Digital Asia Hub and ETDA would like to make a short opening speech. So first up, Dr. Soranan Jiwasurat, the Deputy Executive Director of ETDA, would talk a little bit about the collaboration with Digital Asia Hub.
All right, good afternoon. It's not a speech because I'm not a good speech. Cannot make a good speech, but anyway, I just would like to welcome everyone, especially our friend from Berkman Klein Center to ETDA. And we are here. We are a small organization, and we're trying to push and promoting electronic transaction. As we just had discussion with one of the colleagues that just want to make the bigger picture of Thailand 4.0 to achieve momentarily. And today, I have to apologize because it should be Mrs. Sulankana. She should be here, the one who giving speech. But she has some other important commitment at the National Legislative Assembly. And she will be with us momentarily, very, very short. And very, very excited when I look at the agenda and also the list of the panelists and the speakers that will cover the variety of content that we're going to today. So without any further ado, I think that this should be mark of the beginning of the event between ETDA and the Digital Asia Hub. And hopefully we will have more collaboration and more activity to promoting this kind of promoting electronic transaction to achieve a bigger picture that Thailand 4.0 in the future, more and more often in the future. And I would like to welcome for our international colleague who travel a long way to here, to Thailand. Hopefully that you have already been, get over of your jet lag already. And enjoy the event today and have a pleasant stay in Thailand. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Soranan. Next, could we have Ms. Malavika Sayaram, the Executive Director of Digital Asia Hub Hong Kong, please.
Thank you so much. I first came to Thailand in 1981. Some of you were probably not even born then. But the interesting thing, which I didn't realize until this morning, was that it was the first foreign country I had ever been to. So it feels like I'm actually coming home in a way, rather than this being a completely new journey. It feels like I'm coming full circle to launch this. And for me, what was really interesting as a little kid coming from India was how advanced Thailand seemed. You had vending machines. I'd never seen one before. You had credit cards. I'd never seen one before. So to me, it seemed amazing that just, flying a couple of hours away from my home, I was in a place that seemed so near, but was also in the future. It wasn't in the same present that I lived in. And it was all mediated by technology and by infrastructure. And I find it really interesting that my experience of technology and infrastructure has always been mediated by the foreign. I've always thought of it as something other countries had. And so it's really interesting to me now that through the work that we've been doing at the Digital Asia Hub in the last 2.5 years, that more and more the rest of the world is looking to Asia to say what is local, what is regional, what works in a particular context, what works with a particular language, with a particular culture. And there isn't one size fits all. There isn't one way to look at the world. and we look at it through our different technological, social, cultural, linguistic lenses. And so I think the great promise of technology that we're realizing through the work we've done, and that hopefully the Thailand branch will do as well, is something that I'm so excited about, because it's showing the rest of the world that we're not copycats. We're not people who follow what someone else has created or innovated. We're actually innovating, and innovating in a way that's respectful to our own identities, to our own people, and solving very real problems at scale, at the scale of which Western countries don't often see. They don't have the kinds of populations that we do in Asia. They don't have the poverty and inequality that we do. They don't have the lack of education, healthcare, skills, digital literacy that we see in Asia. So I think the opportunity is tremendous, and I think technology is one way of solving some of those problems, but I think the human element and the way that technology and the human combine to produce really wonderful, efficient, just, and fair outcomes is something that we're all, I think, collectively invested in, and that's why we're all here today. So congratulations to everyone who helped to make this happen, to the ETDA, to Jet, our colleague here, to Urs and the Berkman Klein Center, who helped shape all of this and bring this wonderful collective of people together. Congratulations, and to everyone else, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Malavika. Next, could we have Mr. Yingyong Tantanapongpan, the co-founder and CEO of Digital Asia Hub Thailand.
So thank you, everyone. I think the best people who can represent Digital Asia Hub is not me, it's my friends. Can I invite you to speak a little bit before I speak something further? So without him, Digital Asia Hub Thailand wouldn't have happened. So.
Thank you so much. What a nice surprise to be called on stage immediately. So, but thank you, Chet. I just wanted to echo Malavika's words. I'm here as a learner, first and foremost. We are very excited about playing a role in incubating the Digital Asia Hub here in Thailand. And we are absolutely deeply grateful to ETDA leadership for your support, and also to all the staff members who are just amazing to work with. It's not our first time that we're visiting, and every time there are new ideas for collaboration. I think the purpose of today is very much to have an open and relatively informal conversation about some of the ideas that we collectively are working on, some of the themes that have emerged in previous conversations, and look at this event as an open invitation. It's almost like an appetizer to make everyone even more hungry for more discussions and more collaboration. So I encourage all of you later on also to be really active part in the moderated conversation. This will be as interactive as we can make it. And again, I think each of you and all of us, we have a lot to learn, but also a lot to offer. And I'm personally very much looking forward to these exchanges. So thank you again, particularly to ETDA, to the leadership for the support, for the vision. This is clearly an experiment. We will learn as we go forward, but I strongly feel that very much again in line what Malavika said, also this experiment, the new form of multi-stakeholder hub that brings together government agency, academia, hopefully industry down the road, civil society, that this is very much in the spirit of engaging in mutual learning experiences, in looking for new ways how to address some of the big challenges ahead, embrace some of the big opportunities. And of course, Thailand, with so many big topics right now, whether it's data protection, cybersecurity, e-commerce, and many more issues, is a wonderful place, at least from an academic perspective, to engage in some of these conversations. So thank you so much, Chet. Thank you for all your work. We are classmates of Harvard Law School, and without Chet, I wouldn't be here. So thank you, Chet. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you covered what I want to speak. I think together with it, I think we can work together and then create a a very genuine stakeholder platform, multi-stakeholder platform that we bring together the leaders in the field, government, tech companies, universities, and NGO. Then we can work as one team and then to pursue the right way for the right policies and regulation in the future. Thank you for your participation and I hope you enjoy the event. And then back to the MC. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we have all the speakers just now and Dr. Soranan and our moderators and Dr. Tirani on the stage to have photos together first before we going through our topics. On the stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you again, just to echo all the thank yous that had been said before to ETDA for being such generous hosts. And what a wonderful way to launch the Digital Asia Hub Thailand. May I invite Malavika and Tirani to please come join me up on stage. I just want to say that so pleased to launch, any order you'd like, the Digital Asia Hub here in Thailand. As you heard just a little bit about, the Digital Asia Hub in Hong Kong has set such an amazing foundation across the region, really building networks, convening experts, policymakers, producing research, elevating and making and engaging the most challenging digital policy issues in the entirety of the region. And now it will really deepen its engagement in Thailand through the work that Malavika, Jet, and so many others are doing, and our colleagues at ETDA. So I'm really pleased to kick off this session that's focused on AI in the public interest and how we can understand and use specific examples from case studies that include real-world examples of how AI is being used to advance the public interest, particularly within the context of government services and usage. In a minute, you're going to hear more about a specific set of case studies that the Digital Asia Hub in Hong Kong that Malavika helped to run, that were produced in collaboration with the UN's Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. And that's a set of case studies that has gathered insights from around the world, and it's a set of case studies focused on different examples from around the world, and really looking at not only different regions, countries, and contexts, but not only looking at different regions and countries, but also different contexts and questions. And the production of these case studies, I'll mention, could not have taken place without the engagement of a broader network of internet and society centers that we all work with within the US, Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And you'll also hear from Tiranchi Achaluka, who's a professor at the King Mongkut University, and also helping to lead a lot of work with the Ministry of the Digital Economy here in Thailand. And we really, as was mentioned in the introduction, hope to make this a very interactive conversation. So we really want to take advantage of the deep expertise that's within this room, not only within the Thai context, but that will be the focus of this conversation, but also within the region more generally. So please, please be ready with questions, comments, and ideas after our initial opening remarks. Both Malavika and Tirani will help to set the stage and give us a platform of examples and case studies that help to illustrate the breadth, the depth, and the dynamic nature of the use of AI within public services. As government institutions at all levels, international, regional, national, and local, consider the procurement, the implementation, and using AI-based technologies and techniques, AI really does promise some potential greater speedy, more efficient, and more precise ways to go about advancing the public interest through government services. But policymakers also need to consider the challenges, the unanticipated consequences, as well as the limitations. And I hope that the cases we'll talk about today will really help to ground this conversation in real-world examples that are playing out. And so with that, let me first introduce Tirani, or welcome Tirani, to offer a couple of minutes of just her perspectives on what's happening within Thailand, the work that she's done, and how that informs the conversation around AI in Thailand right now, and to give us a sense of the landscape. Thank you, Tirani.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the invitation as well. My name is Tirani. Like he said, I'm actually a professor in computer engineering, but right now I am on secondment, pretty much loaned to the Ministry of Digital Economy full-time to help promoting big data / data science / AI project for the government sector. And initiatives in Thailand has been for a while. I guess there are quite a few prototyping projects going on with different ministry. Right now, the actual platform that DE is trying to set up is to raise the level of HR in technology, not specifically to AI, but mostly technology for Thai employees. I mean, the nature of big data, data science, or AI project is that it's hard to make it a turnkey project. You can't just hire some consultant and have it be turnkey as a project and be used forever. It's not sustainable. The only way is you actually have to bring internal capacity up to the level in order to be able to maintain the project after the delivery of the first phase. So we are having a lot of training for deep expert in using AI for a lot of government service. So that's one thing we do. We do the trainings and working with internal government people to build project and help us do the project. The second thing is the team, me and myself and the team has helped building several different prototypes. Later on, I'll tell you a few for different ministry and having the data linkage across the ministry in order to do this. And the last thing is we're trying to do this show and share thing where we discuss progress of different places so that ministry can learn from another ministry. But when we talk about AI, you know that it's narrow intelligence and general intelligence, right? Narrow intelligence means that the artificial intelligence that is very good in some specific topic, like a chatbot, things like that. General intelligence would means AI that are specific to many topics. I can safely say that in government sector, most of the things we do is narrow intelligence AI, meaning that you need a lot of data set coming in to train the machine using several machine learning / deep learning algorithms to create a model that make prediction of something. So this is pretty much a typical type of use cases that we do. I don't know of any initiatives that trying to build something like AlphaGo where it's generalized AI quite yet, except from academia where a research group is working on. So just to say a few use cases where narrow AI has been used. One thing is a very popular project around the country, I guess, is something called chatbot, right? It's basically machine learning and natural language processing put together to build a bot that can answer questions. What we do here in Thailand, because of the challenge of the Thai language, which is a little bit more complicated than English in many ways, we don't have something that's similar to Google Assistants where you can make a call to a salon and talk to human without human knowing that they're talking to the bot. But we do have some of the chat things. One thing that we have a use case on is the chatbot for hospital, for example. Hospital in Thailand, when you go to a public hospital, you generally queue up for like 4, 5 to 8 hours before you get services, which is kind of hard for a lot of Thai citizens. So when I stand there and observe, the nurse has answered the same questions at least like 20 times in 5 minutes. Like questions like, where's the bathroom? What do I have to do to get my health check? Where do I have to go? Where's the elevator? Things like that. So we figure that these are specific enough of the topic that you can train the bot to answer. So there has been initiatives like this to build a chatbot for a specific topic. So in my team, we help build a chatbot to chat with hospitals instead of hospital staff answering basic questions. And the bot speaks both Thai and English, so it's help when you're a foreigner and you don't speak Thai and you have to go to Thai governments, it's help with that too. So that's one thing we do. And I think we have built a chatbot for HR, for government sector, answer questions on reimbursement, on training schedules and things like that, specific topic. Other than chatbot example, I think all of you probably know of recommender models where like Lazada or Amazon used to recommend products to a customer segmentation and then product recommender. We have done one of the initiatives that working with a few foundations as well as Ministry of Health and built a health recommender for people who have diabetes and hypertension who lives outside of Bangkok, where getting to hospital and getting hospital care is relatively difficult. So what we do is, in Thailand, we have a health staff network outside of Bangkok that can go on to different houses, like make a house call, a house visit to take informations. So basically what we do is we build a simple mobile app so they can carry with them to the house and then ask questions according to what the doctor recommended and take notes. And once we have a lot of these together with the blood tests, we can sort of know what kind of actions or activities that make diabetes or hypertension worse for this particular patients and for this particular local area. So right now we get to that. In the future, what we can do is we can use this data that we have been gathering to train using machine learning recommender systems that make recommendations to each particular specific patients on what they should do to improve their health. So very similar to a product recommendations on Amazon, but this is sort of a health recommender. And also when we have budgets in the future, we can include some things like the Internet of Things so that when the health worker go visit, make a house call, they can do blood tests and simple things that can feed data to the cloud so the doctors can make recommender faster. Because in Thailand, you know, outside of Bangkok, we don't have enough doctor. In the Bangkok area, we do. So that's another initiatives related to AI that we do is our narrow intelligence. And recently, since I joined the Ministry of DE, we have discussed at least 5 different projects that will started within this budget year, which started in October. One is in tourism, because tourism is very much use a lot of data from a lot of places. We don't actually specifically use data from Ministry of Tourists. We can also buy data and use data from public sectors available to make guided tour for people from different places in Thailand to promote secondary cities. So people when come to Thailand, not necessarily having to go to Chiang Mai, Phuket, or Bangkok, but they can go to secondary cities. And if we can know the sector of, say, if we know that the French people always wants to go to Chiang Rai, then Chiang Rai should have signs in French, things like that. Or if something troubling the tourists about the services that the local provide, we can dig out and find the root cause and know what that's about. So this is the one thing that we are going to be working on that has a lot of AI and data involved. The second project is about tax. So the tax and revenue of the country is always very important, and I'm sure many countries has this kind of use cases. Basically, we can try to segment different SMEs in different business, like if you're in, say, tourist business, or if you're in retail business, things like that. The size of your business, coupling with a couple of factors, what kind of revenue should you be making? And when you report tax and it's a lot less than we expected, then we can alert an auditor. So basically, we try to segment and find people or business who are very likely to underpay tax, and then, you know, initiates the audits based on actual information rather than based on, you know, the gut feelings of the auditor. So that's one other project that we are looking at. And the third one is more on the NLP side, on natural language processing side. Right now, the statistics department in Thailand, they do surveys, like as in take pencil and paper or iPad and walk to people and ask questions and take surveys. Some of the topics we can make the survey easier by gathering information of what Thai people is feeling or what Thai people is thinking about certain topics from social media, because Thailand, we are very high on the usage of social media. Everybody whined on Facebook and things like that. So with a particular topic, we probably can get an answer of what people are thinking based on particular topics, and then we do simple basic sentiment analysis. It's a little bit less simple when you have to do it in Thai, but that's something that use AI specifically to do this. So survey general public opinion, as well as understand public service quality in terms of speeds, in terms of performance, and things like that. So those are the third project that we're working on. And I think the last one that we just discussed among our teams and also with some of the government agency is on the road accidents. How do we reduce the road accidents based on information that we can gather? Maybe we can make a prediction, understand a root cause instead of using gut feelings. So that's another thing that this project is just started and we haven't really gathered the data yet. So I would say of all the use cases, which the next round I can share more, of all the use cases that I've talked about, the challenging things would fall along the line of data and people. In Thailand, we don't have enough experts who understand machine learning AI or understand that data science or even business intelligence in general. We don't have enough of those in the public sector. And the second thing, as important as that, the first one, is we don't have a good quality data in certain area. So sometimes data gathering is a big challenge. And also there's a border between, getting data from agency A to agency B so that data can be in one pot so we can do analytics because of the, GDPR and all the hype with the data privacies. And so cross-boundary of data is very challenging in Thailand. And I'm sure everywhere in Asia as well, except China. So these are the two challenges that I would think we have to kind of overcome to be able to do that, which I think we're heading off to a good start and moving along quite nicely, because one of the things that happened in the past 6 months is I managed to get data related to a certain set of people to do one AI analytics from 5 ministries. And it took me 2 months to gather all those data, which is, miraculously possible. So with enough force, with enough usage that people can see, usefulness that people can realize what we can do if you give us data, sometimes we can, discuss, talk, and gather data. But right now, it's sort of a case-by-case basis. We have to MOU with specific agency. I hope that one day when we can have sort of a more business architect where requesting data across agency can happen systematically through the systematic way, not having to know people and call people and do MOU with specific agency. So I guess, is that my 7 minutes?
Yes, that's
okay,
really
I'll stop right here if you have questions.
I might actually, so that was a really helpful overview of the landscape, and I think you did a really helpful job in actually talking about so many of the different types of technologies and techniques that are actually involved in AI. So one of the main questions that we often explore, or one of the main issues that policymakers often come to the Berkman Klein Center and express, is that just understanding what the bounds and the definitions of AI are. What is AI? And it sounds like there are so many different techniques and technologies, everything from natural language processing to chatbots to recommendation systems, and it seems like that at least within a couple of the examples that you talked about, these are all being employed. So how do you sort of describe that and translate the breadth of that definitional question, but then also knowing that AI does involve so many different types of techniques and technologies, what are the ways that you can build capacity internally at the government so that government services can identify practical solutions based off of those different technologies?
A lot of things you mentioned, like a chatbot or NLP engine, those are, to me at least, is an application of an AI. Machine learning is a subset of the term AI. Machine learning is AI that use statistics. And deep learning is a subset of machine learning where we use a lot of iterative looping in order to train the AI. So the easiest way to describe what a machine learning is, which is the most popular series of algorithms family that is used in narrow intelligence AI, would be you need a lot of historical data, a large piece of databases with records, raw data, not aggregated data. And then you are trying to study the pattern inside that data. When you try to study the pattern inside of that data, what you use is actually statistics. And once you find a pattern, you can create a mathematical equations, a set of mathematical equations to represent that pattern. Now that you have mathematical equations that represent the pattern, when a new data point in, you can make prediction. So you can feed the input into this math, and it is predict. For example, if you try to build a robot that can clean a house, if you take a picture of a lot of this room, for example, and then you have human labeled that this is the clean room, this is a dirty room, and you take many angles and many pictures, these are inputs. You use this set of labeled input to train using machine learning, then the robot will have in its minds mathematical equations that understand that this picture is clean or dirty. Once it makes that decision, it can derive a path to move from the dirty to the clean. So basically, you need a lot of historical data to use to train machine learning, because all machine learning does is finding patterns in data and then represent pattern with math equations. So that's what machine learning is. That's why statistics is very important. Now, deep learning is, when you use machine learning, generally you iterate for about 3 to 5 times. In deep learning, it's deeper pipe.
Great. Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I was thinking that in your description of both the existing and future potential of these technologies and their use within government, what's your sense of, at least within the Thai government, how much upskilling needs to happen? Because you talked a little bit about developing that capacity, and do you feel like people understand the potentials, or that there's still a long way to go to get them to understand that potential and then identify those particular application areas? Or is it happening everywhere?
I think everybody's realized that we need to use data analytics to benefit government somehow. And the management see that data-driven decision is something that they need to adopt within their agency, at least many of them in government sectors. If they understand the engine of AI, I'm not so sure. You know how that data scientist is very rare in Thailand? Because our education has been that if you studied math, you study math. If you studied computer engineering, then you know how to program. So it's very hard to find a programmer with a very good statistics background, because math students hate programming and a computer student hate math. So when you hired people and the internal workforce within the governments right now, I think it's a little bit of a challenge to try to train them to understand the science behind. So we're talking narrow intelligence at least. So, but I have started the program to train. I mean, when I train, I don't mean talking to 1,000 people at the same time and inspire them to want to do AI, but I mean taking, say, 20 to 30 people from government sectors and then train them for 6 months for them to understand what data analytics is. In that tier, I think it's been okay, but we haven't, our reach is not that far. We have probably trained a few hundreds, not like thousands and thousands of people. But the realizations of the technology is very wide. The adoption of technology is started, but the learning curve is still there, I would say.
Great, no, thank you. And I do hope that in a couple of minutes we can also hear from all the experts in the room who are working within Thai ministries and different departments about sort of the use and the potential and the opportunity of AI technologies within their own work. But before we do that, why don't I turn over now to Malavika, who can speak a little bit more. So that was a really great grounding within the Thai context. I think lots of very concrete examples of how AI is both within use and can be used, and we'll get, I think, a little bit more into the challenges in a second. But Malavika can talk hopefully a little bit more about regional efforts and ideas and a couple of case studies from around the globe that I think will extend this conversation and add more examples.
I'm particularly happy to see that the skills that do exist in Thailand are in women data scientists and engineers. So as a woman myself in this, trying to get more women in tech and STEM, it's really wonderful to see that. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And the first thing it tells me is that we should have had you write one of our case studies. So I feel like any one of the three things that you mentioned in particular of how government has deployed it should actually be in our anthology. But just to give you a very, very quick overview, and I'm not going to go into all the detail, is this project was something that was a piece of joint research commissioned by the UN SCAP and Google. And we actually shared some of the findings yesterday at the UN Conference Center very briefly on the sidelines of a ministerial meeting which some of you were at. And we presented very, very high-level findings from 9 case studies which come from all over the world, some from Asia and some from beyond. So just to credit them very quickly, we have one from the Australian infamous robo-debt scenario, trying to automate fraud detection, which was done by the Berkman Klein Center. We had one, again from Australia, on Nadia, which was the voice and the chatbot used to help people navigate the National Disability Insurance Scheme. There was one which was done in Brazil, which was actually a citizen-led initiative, not a government-led one, but it had very useful learnings. It was very famously called Serenata de Amor, based on one of the favorite chocolates in Brazil. And that was actually looking at public spending. And that came from an old movie where somebody was, he was, his tax fraud was detected because of a brand that he used to purchase that he shouldn't have. So again, they used this chocolate metaphor there. And then this was to see whether citizens whether public officials were spending money within mandated limits as government officials. Then there was a very interesting one, again, you mentioned tax administration. There was one looking at, the refund process in Germany, whether people were actually getting refunds for spurious and erroneous claims. There was one from India on the use of AI to help farmers know exactly the week in which they should sow their seeds to maximum yield and output, using weather data and using open data that the meteorological departments had, but also other kinds of farming data. And again, it shows that not all AI is at the very high-tech level. It's also using old-school industries and sectors like farming and agriculture. Then there's one which I'll go into a little more detail, which is from Israel, which is on automating the trademark registration process, which you would be interested in, I think, making that quicker, more efficient, and also helping to find, where logos are deceptive and identical. There was one from Singapore, which was where the Singapore government created a fintech regulatory sandbox to help companies trial and pilot the use of AI before they unleashed it on the wider population, and to actually, recalibrate, see what didn't work in the field. And then finally, there were two, one from the UK, which was on policing and law enforcement, and how do you map areas of crime so that you can better deploy police forces to the areas that most need it. And there was another one from India, because of course it's a country so big you can have 2 case studies, and that's okay. And this again, you mentioned that the diabetes case here in Thailand. This was about using AI to prevent blindness, diabetic and other kinds of retinopathies that are detected very early through the use of machine learning. So this was, a very broad set across many sectors. And I think the most interesting one, just to give you a few lessons from, what came out, I think the Israel case study meant, really highlight some things, and some which are very interesting in how government can actually go about deploying these, and how the public and private sector can work in very useful and fruitful ways. And in this case, what they did was they actually launched a competition where they said, it was actually very innovative, because they said every year you partner with a particular government department that says, we've got all kinds of problems we'd like help with. Every year it was one particular area within government that offered up a challenge saying we'd like help. So in this particular case, that year it was the Department of Justice. And so it came out with, the people who won this competition were 3 students, 1 PhD and 2 master's students, which I think is very interesting, because it shows you don't have to have extremely highly skilled, expensive, resources that are insourced, or you don't need to outsource it to a big technological company. Even 3 students can actually end up automating and augmenting an existing process in ways that may not seem magical or rocket science, but drastically improve a process and make people's lives very easy. And Israel already thinks of itself as a sort of startup nation. It's all about innovation, everything from how do you have water in a place that's mostly desert, which informs their attitude to technology. And so they actually have an innovation authority since 2016, and I understand Thailand is also very similar. And thinking of innovation as a natural resource almost, when you may not have many others. And I think, again, that's something we see in a lot of Asia, where data might be a resource, human capital, software programmers, or even actual data points from large populations is seen as an asset. And in this case, what they did was they found a way to actually use 4 different types of AI technologies to actually look, when someone tries to apply for a trademark, to say, is there something that already is registered? But instead of only looking at the sort of classic Vienna classification system, which is how usually people do it manually, and go through records after records looking at keywords and tags, this actually automates this very quickly, but then makes it much more nuanced because it uses 4 different types of tools to actually have a much more nuanced understanding. And I don't want to bore you with the details of all the different tools, but they came up with this. And I think the other interesting learning was often people in the private sector, people in startups, even people who are assisting the government, the biggest challenge is not necessarily a technological one. It's finding the right person in government to be a champion. It's knowing who do you call and say, we've developed something really cool, would you like to roll this out and even pilot it? Or the other problem that often happens is people don't have access to the data that is held by either one particular department or is dispersed across multiple departments, which you also pointed out as a challenge, saying, if we only had the right champion within government, could we actually have access to data sets that would then help our system learn in real time, dynamically, learn the flaws, learn the contours? And I think the other very interesting insight from this was that they, from the get-go, had to actually work with people rather than deploy a solution, sell it to government, and then have government say, oh, you know what, this doesn't work for all these various reasons. In this case, they actually had to work from the get-go. They won the competition, and it was a period of mentorship. So it went from a competition to actually being more like an incubator where they had experts who could take a very raw idea that students came up with and help develop it, mentor it, help shape it in ways that could scale, help them meet the right technological partners. And so they deployed this within government, and right now they're putting it into trial, so they can't exactly measure yet whether it's a success. But the person in charge of this program, the head of the trademarks division, actually said that they've trialed many sort of machine-led ways to automate this very, very tedious process. Most of them have failed in very real ways, but they think that this actually has the most promise of everything they've seen. But they also acknowledged a point which I think is very useful for the whole family of case studies that we've looked at, which is that when you're dealing with certain use cases like this, if there's an error, if the system wrongly classifies something, it ends up accepting the trademark registration because it doesn't match it with an existing logo. You end up accepting that registration and granting it. It then means you're giving someone a trademark that they never had the right to, and then you're actually infringing on something that exists. So your tolerance level has to be really, really narrow. So I think a lesson from that, and which you see across the other sectors, whether it's policing, law enforcement, decision making, sentencing especially, is maybe if you're new to using AI within government, maybe you want to start with something where your tolerance levels are a little more generous. You don't start with something where the risks, the consequences, the potential for collateral damage is something either very real, emotional, it denies people welfare, it denies them food, it means that they don't get access to something without which they can't survive. Maybe you want to try with something like, an educational tool that might help, but it doesn't actually prejudice someone so badly if it's not 100% accurate. So I think in terms of looking at challenges and obstacles, they identified what I think of as sort of 4 bundles, and this is my terminology, not theirs, but again, it works across the German example, the Indian example, the Australian examples, where some of the gaps that these case studies highlighted was, one, you could have a very real skills gap where you don't have the data scientists, you don't have the machine learning specialists, and you have to source them somehow. The second challenge in this case was they said there was a bureaucracy gap or a process gap where even though they'd won the competition, the government process, the procurement process was they still needed to go through a tender process, which is not new to anyone working in government. By the time they went through the tender process, the technology was almost outdated and redundant. So in response to that, they came up with a very dynamic and unusual solution where they said, maybe we should also change the procurement process such that the tender doesn't have to be a completed product. It can be a work in progress. And the government actually contracted with 3 partners in parallel saying, let's trial all these 3 things as pilots so that we don't lose time. And then the one that's the most successful is something that's already, halfway to being rolled out. So I think even through and this is something that could never have happened if they hadn't been embedded so closely working within government. The third gap was sort of a vocabulary or language gap where each had to learn the other one's vocabulary. It was either what is AI, what can be automated, do you use sentiment analysis, what does that even mean? But also understanding, in this particular case, saying, oh, we just want to find images that match. No, you also need to make sure it matches certain keywords that exist within the trademark classification system, which to a lay computer programmer, they don't know what the trademark landscape looks like. So they had to learn a vocabulary before their product could be fit for purpose. And I think finally, there's also what I like to think of as sort of an expectation gap. And this is something that came across in many case studies where, like in the UK example, they thought the thing that AI would produce would be somehow magical and really transformative and very cool. And the maps that AI produced would look somehow different, would feel, fundamentally like something very new and cool. And when they saw the maps, they thought, this looks like the maps, then this is like Google Maps. What's so different? It uses GPS, geolocation, what's different? And they were like, yes, but this is something that would have taken months and years to create. This happened in a couple of days with AI, right? So the real magic is behind the scenes. It's not in what it looks like. And again, here with the trademark example, where people saw the end result and they said, this is a failure, or it's very disappointing to the trademarks office because it failed to replace a human. And then the computer scientists had to say, no, we never tried to replace a human. We tried to make their life easier or more efficient or make it, a better service. It was never intended to replace the human. It was meant to augment, enhance, and improve their lives and improve the efficacy of the government service so that end users, citizens also had more trust. And the final thing I'll leave you with is this was meant to be a product that helped the government, that helped it improve its trademark registration process. But the very cool thing that they did was they also made this platform open to citizens. So anybody could go and look and query the portal to see if there was something matching. So it meant that it also served as an external filter where people would say, I'm thinking of registering this trademark. They'd go and look in this database and find, oh, someone already has something very similar, I won't bother registering this. So it also meant that instead of getting hundreds and thousands of junk applications or applications that were so similar that they were going to be rejected, instead of the government having to deal with a backlog or deal with a huge volume, many of them got filtered out at the level of citizen engagement without it even coming through the process. So that, again, was a different kind of cost and time saving. So I think this was something we kept seeing across a lot of the case studies where it said, look at the human element, look at how human and machine work together in tandem. And sometimes you have magic, sometimes you have incremental goals, but even those can actually be hugely transformative, especially I think that's a lesson for developing economies where any money saved is this huge thing and it frees up resource for other things. So, happy to talk more in the questions.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and I think such a great set of perspectives from around the globe, and in particular that deep dive into Israel and trademark. And one of the things that I thought was really helpful, and I was hoping we could get into in the second part of this conversation, was specifically around some of those gaps and challenges, which I think you identified in a really helpful way. And I know we started talking about with respect to what's happening in Thailand with some of the skills gaps and the issues around data. But Tirini, I wonder if I might also ask you to dive a little bit more deeply into some of the challenges, perhaps reacting to or responding to if there are similar challenges to the ones that Malavika described, if there are others, or if there are challenges and gaps related to some of the specific applications that you talked about, whether it be in healthcare or other areas of government service.
Like I said before, the challenges has always been in HR and data, because like I said, AI, you use data. If the data to start out with is not consistent, not complete, and not right, these kind of problems create a wrong mathematical model. So you still be able to make prediction, they're just wrong. So basically in an AI systems, garbage in, garbage out, like people said. So making sure of data is the first stage that every agency should start it. You should have data governance framework that govern how you take data into the database, and sets of rules of how do you random check your database and make sure data quality is up to the standard to be used for analytics using AI or whatnot. So that's one of the challenging things that I find it's difficult. And this is one of the reasons why data exchange across agency is very difficult. Because when you're not sure of your own data, certainly you don't want to share with your friends because it could be wrong. And it could, people could yell at you for that. So that's one thing. And I think policy-wise, to go over the burden of this is, like people always says that having sort of a bad data maybe is better than no data at all. So everybody has to take a first step and start somewhere. So don't hold people responsibility for poor quality of data and penalize them too heavily. Otherwise, sharing of data cannot happen in the future. And without the sharing of data, it's hard to model good AI that benefit and have real impact on societies. Because very few use cases where you can only use data from your internal database. Most of the time, you need data from outside and across of agency. Even the trademark things, you obviously has to go online, use data online to figure out images from others and also from repository of their own countries and things like that. So it takes effort to keep your data clean and nice with the good qualities. And I think that's one of the challenges that should be. And another thing is but it's not my territory, but still the law needs to be updated somehow to, government red tape is happening everywhere across of Asia, making process so slow because we need to investigate so many things. One of the problem with that is because the government process has been designed in Thailand, most of them like 50 years ago, without technology. Once the technology comes, the rule need to update to go with the technology. The process need to update. And the exchanging of data, the law about data privacy should be reviewed and looked at and understand a little bit more. I didn't say it should be lesser. I just said it should be revealed and maybe make informed decision based on current technology and current risk, more so than previous technology and previous risk. So these are a couple of pillars that we need to look at before we can sort of say that Thai government use AI across the board. It's always easier for a smaller country that was born on digital like Estonia, but country that has systems for a long time to transform from the old system to the new system is always harder than to just born on the new system. So that's some of the, I guess, problems that people need to realize and work through it.
Great. Well, why don't I pause there and see if people have questions? So I think any clarifying questions about the cases that were discussed, or if there is also perspectives, particularly from our Thai colleagues or others working within the region that they'd like to add in terms of interesting cases that it might be useful to discuss.
Thank you very much. I'm Sri. I'm Sri from IEEE. One of the challenges, at least, you talked about India and sowing the seeds, and when we do kind of market predictions, if you have an AI model, and if the AI model is very accurate, then everybody sows the seed at the same time, there's surplus. If the AI model is bad, then you have a crop failure. So how do you include certain amount of randomness? As humans, we all make certain predictions. There is some variability in the equation which allows for the economy to kind of balance itself. In an AI kind of a setting, I'm curious how this will all work out.
Sure. If you want to put their hands in, you can answer while I kind of scan the room.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think in the example of the Indian case study, what our researchers at the CIS in Bangalore looked at was actually a pilot project that is being done with the Andhra Pradesh government and Microsoft. And so I think the approach they've adopted there is to actually do a pilot and to actually test it versus, how well does the AI model work versus if people were using old school methods or mixed set of methods. So I think that will help inform it to some extent. So it's not something that's been widely rolled out. It's not something that's replacing every other way of functioning. So I think, again, recalibrating that is also really useful. I think what they felt was, and I'm speaking for somebody else who wrote the case study, but I think what was very instructive in that case was they said, rather than a sort of general approach to saying, let's look at every single factor that affects yield, they narrowed it down very specifically saying, let's just look at this one aspect. And that's the only bit where they're trying to actually use machine learning, which I think, so there you have the chaos and randomness built in because every other metric, every other thing that affects yield is still as is. So they're just tweaking one element to see if that actually has a huge potential. So I think that sort of large-scale wiping out of all crops if one monsoon fails or something, I don't think that's going to happen, but it's a really good point. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Brian Tang from ACMI in Hong Kong. Tyranny, one of my initiatives is I work with IEEE in terms of its AI initiative. And on the policy committee, one of the recommendations is exactly what you're doing, i.e. increasing the capacity building at government level. And that's one of the recommendations, to actually inject and allow for more schemes to have private sector or academics to work in government. So I'm so pleased to hear that. The question for you is, would love to hear how perhaps that arose here in Thailand, and whether there are models that others in other countries can actually adopt. And then if I had a second one, if you don't mind, for Malavika. So as you may know, my area of focus is more from industry and regtech, and AI applications, regtech, are quite tremendous in terms of use for fraud detection. And recently I ran a legal tech, regtech hackathon in Hong Kong, and the winner actually was an access to justice program which used AI. So I was wondering whether you would consider regtech and soup tech, as some might call it, as part of your case studies in future. Thank you.
What I'm trying to do right now, at least the Ministry of DE is trying to do, is first they sort of loan me from the universities, and I come with a team, and I'm building new team, and our team mission, I'm trying to get up to 100 people scale within the next year with expert at some level. Not all senior experts, some of them will be junior experts who can do prototype and programming for government sector. Our role is not to implement everything for every government sectors. Our role is to advise and tells you, if you were to begin the big data project or AI project, what are the sequencing of things that should happen in order, because if you start procurement on the wrong order, you wasted money on the first few years. So what is the right way to do things? Discuss with them the context of what would be right, and so that across government agency, technology use are sort of the same, with the goal in the future that data exchange can happen relatively effortless if everything is built for that goal in the future. I mean, exchanging data systematically is not happening in Thailand right now due to a lot of things happening. But if you move the right way in any agency, move the same way at the very least. And right now, because Thai government hired a provider to do a turnkey project for IT, right? It's hard to control unless your TOR has, talked about certain specific policy and technologies. And we're hoping that we can provide that kind of services, like standards that everyone should meet. We don't have to lock the specification. We just need to advise the standard, the policy, the general technology themes that people are using around the world, so that in the future that can happen. So learning people from academia have helped a lot, in my opinion, because I work with at least 10 data scientists from my own universities. They are junior faculty member who just graduated within the last 5 years, mostly from the US. These are people who knows how to do data analytics, but these are people who do not know business because they has been studying from kindergarten all the way to PhD, never really talk to customer. So getting them out of university, talk to real customer, government or private sectors, and broaden their horizon a lot. And they become better professor because the next time they teach in class, they don't just talk math. They talk human language and also math. So that had helped the professor. And when you get professor to come help with one project, professor always come with student in their lab. So you get students out of the universities and start cleaning real data instead of using data download from Kaggle or the internet. That's data already cleaned. So work with real data from Thai governments. Challenging is a lot greater, but they learn of what they have to do. So we equip new generation of students to be a little bit more market ready. The only problem I see is that we can only do so much, right? Like I can safely say I produce junior data scientists at the student level who actually are market ready at about 20 people a year. And we probably need like 1,000. So this is a effort that need to be coordinated among universities. And another things that we're trying to do is to get other universities involved. And then getting the training set that is not just us providing the training, but everyone is providing the same training and go towards what we call the micro-credential if you're in education. Micro-credential, don't talk about courses to credit as much, talk about skills, learning outcome, micro-credential, and then you can award degree based on that. That's the way you can do adult sector educations and not only, kids from high school to increase manpower of at least in data science and AI.
Did you want to quickly answer that second question?
Sure. On the civic tech, I think the Brazil case study is something you would find really, really interesting, but also I think the Singapore one because it's fintech and the regulatory sandbox. But I'll mention the Brazil one very quickly because it's specifically saying this is something that's in the public interest. It's not being done top-down by government, but it's civil society-led. It was actually crowdsourced and crowdfunded. Which I think is really interesting because the funding came from, a diversity of sources. So it was owned by the public and they wanted it to succeed. But it was also crowdsourced in the sense that, the software repositories were on GitHub. People actually helped tag the content. They also had a public-facing chatbot called Rosie. So Rosie would keep tweeting saying, oh, this guy says, the bill for this restaurant seems really high. And then lots of people would share their receipts and tag it on Twitter saying, oh, I had dinner there yesterday. It cost, $400 for 2 people. How come this guy spent $2,000 in one evening, right? So people kept showing their receipts and stuff, so it helped keep improving the system. But I think it also, it was, again, access to information, just as you mentioned, but what was the problem they were trying to solve was Brazil had access to information laws. People were not implementing it usefully, and citizens weren't actually making use of all kinds of public data that existed to actually make public expenditure transparent and to make officials accountable. So I think initially there was a little bit of resistance from government saying, hang on a minute, you're showing all these outliers, you're embarrassing us in public. But over time, it actually ended up when it showed the kind of savings that could have been made had these people actually submitted the right receipts and not overbilled the government and stayed within limits. When the government realized that there was actually a huge benefit to the exchequer from this project, then it wasn't so much about the embarrassment and the public shaming of officials, it was actually about the systemic benefit from cost savings. So then they sort of endorsed it and say, actually, it's a great project and, we should do it. But then it's, again, the emotional and human labor of keeping this going. And again, it's something that came out in a lot of our case studies saying it's very easy to launch something very cool, but keeping it ongoing, sustainable, maintaining the integrity, the data quality, building in, ways to check for bias, lack of representation in data sets, like how do you actually counter for those? So I think, again, there's a lot of room for improvement as it goes along, particularly when it's public facing and everyone is invested in it.
Herbert Burkert, Digital Asia Hub, University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. In this Thai procedure you have described to us very well, at which stage do you make the difference between causation and coincidence. The classical cases in areas of high alcoholism, you have a high presence of social workers, so take out the social workers and you stop alcoholism. It's a classical methodological question in statistics, so do you have a sort of procedure there to look into that? Thank you.
Don't know. Most of the project that has been tackling has not been dealing with that, actually. Yeah, you can go ahead and comment on that.
There's a very funny way that people have actually pointed out exactly the philosophical problem you mentioned, which was a whole series of cartoons on correlation versus causation, showing the really absurd links between, 4,000 people commit suicide every year in Santa Monica, but 4,000 is also the number of people who use this brand of toothpaste. Is it coincidence? Is it causation? You don't know. And I think it was pointing out how when in government services in particular, if you mistake correlation for causation, you might actually be coming up with very unfair, unjust outcomes. And I think that's why a lot of our case studies urge caution in the way that you approach this. But I think also finding ways to really narrow the questions that are being asked and where you rely only on the data. And I think the policing examples from the UK actually highlight the problem you refer to, which is if you look for crime in particular neighborhoods, you're going to find it. And then the crime reduces. Is it because you deployed 600 officers, or is it because of some other factor? So I think that's a very real problem, and I think it's something that a lot of the research is grappling with, and I don't think there's a full solution yet.
I don't think there's a solution to that, a specific solution to that quite.
I'm not looking for solutions, because when you're dealing with problems which don't have solutions, you need procedures. And this is what I've been asking for.
Procedure. Cases that I work with is mainly has massive data, and when you have large enough data, coincidence happen less. Unlike, say, in healthcare, where you collect data of 100 people and says eating egg is good, eating egg is not good, based on 100 out of a 6 billion. That's a too small subset of a data to be a representative of the whole domain, basically. So when you do sampling, data sampling, make sure you do it fairly, and make sure, the experimenter actually take the designer experiment course and understand all those kind of concepts would probably be the right procedure, wouldn't you say? But yeah.
There's a lot of call for independent audits, different ways that people can query not just the data going in, but the process. And one approach is also to try and look under the black box in different ways, or use different proxies to see whether the outcome, even if you can't see exactly what happened, whether you know the data that went in, the result that came out, is there a proxy that you can measure for fairness, accountability, and transparency? And I think Urs has also written deeply about the role of academia in this as a sort of honest, independent auditor of these processes. And I think as Facebook is realizing now, after all the accusations of tampering with elections or with, post-Cambridge Analytica, where they've historically been very reluctant to let people look under the hood and look at their data sets and look at the algorithms, look at the processes. Now they're coming up with ways to make their data available in a confidential basis with civil society, with members of academia, who can actually query it and test it for exactly these kinds of errors and different ways that correlation might end up with predictive policing in ways that are really a quantum leap from that data. So I think there are different ways that they're trying to tackle it.
Hello, my name is Lauren Prosimqua with the OECD and also research affiliate to the Berkman Klein Center. So my question, it relates to the point that you made on, that you highlighted on the need of historical data sets for use in machine learning. And my question is about the role of National Statistics Office. What do you see their role is? How do you think that your learning now during the government can feed into their changing role? And what do you see, or if you can share with us a wish list where you think that needs to change?
Okay. I actually work a lot with Department of Statistics right now because they're under the same ministry and we work closely. When the data science and AI coming into the picture, we found out that a lot of HR in this department is actually not equipped for that because their background is in survey and statistics, basic statistics. And it's a little bit hard to cross over. Obviously, being called the Department of Statistics, they should be the host of a lot of data. But they have actually a lot of data, but mostly are statistics data. Where you're talking machine learning, you need raw data, not statistics, not aggregated data. Raw data is actually owned by other departments. And statistics. So the role, I'm not sure if the role would be for a particular department, but some government central role should be sort of facilitator to gather raw data for a different project, for different topics, for other government agencies. And I don't know if this particular department will become that will have the center role in Thailand for now.
I think also one of the problems is just differing standards and lack of interoperability. There's all kinds of amazing data that's collected through census, through other kinds of statistical efforts. One, people don't know they exist, so they don't know how to even access them, they don't know how to ask. And I think the second problem is even when the data exists, it's either not digitized, it's not in a format that's useful, the APIs don't allow you to pull them, and I think IEEE has done some work towards standards around these. But I think, again, if you can't make the data legible and usable, then a lot of the utility is lost. So I think also that translation function in saying, how do you unlock the potential?
But I think also through the exercise of you trying to do AI machine learning, you start identifying the information gap and where data is actually missing. So my question is also how your experience can feed into that and inform the government on here we need to collect more data and we need to do more effort in collecting that, especially for digital trends which are new and historical data doesn't exist yet.
Every ministry, when I start consulting with them about a data project, will start off with data collection and data cleansing. It's very rare that we start off with data analytics. So new ways to gathering of data, new technology to gathering of data, what is cloud should be used for, how useful can IoT be for your particular project has always been the start. And surprisingly, Department of Statistics, HR knows a lot about data. They know who has what, and that has helped me a lot. And right now, when I talk to government sector, I try to educate on external data sources and different data sources altogether. What kind of thing can you learn outside of your database or even outside of government agency? Recently, when we talked about this tourism project, we found out that data that we cannot have from the police and for the customs, we can actually buy off of ETDA. If you want to know who's flying into Thailand, at what time on what flight, that data is for sales by ETDA. And also, this is an example that you can actually buy data, gather data from external sources, or write tools to grab data off of either sensors, social media, internet, or whatever. So that's very useful tools to know.
So we've only got a couple minutes left. I might just ask for any last questions and queue up last questions. If anybody else has them, we'll just take them all at once.
So this is not a question, but more of a comment. We are talking a lot about data sets. Within IEEE, we have a data port project within IEEE Big Data. So they are collecting a lot of data sets, and it's used for research. It's open source. It's anybody can use it freely. One of the things, data sets that they have is on Indian diabetic retinopathy image data set. So there are about 30-40 data sets. It's minuscule compared to what we want, but I would encourage people to look at IEEE data port. Thank you.
Any other last comments or questions? I had one for both of you, which is also bringing it back to the reason why we're here and launching the Digital Asia Hub in Thailand, and in related to our conversations about thinking about how we can create better coordination mechanisms, what are ways that that academia can help the public sector, what are ways that we can create public and private partnerships, and knowing that this is an interesting format for a partnership between ETDA and the Digital Asia Hub in Thailand, what guidance might you give in terms of the role that Digital Asia Hub Thailand could play in helping to build capacity, develop skills, really and mitigate some of the challenges that are happening with AI and the public interest?
I have worked with a lot of private sectors and a lot of public sector, but to link them together has always been a challenge. And sometimes it's strange that we need to have international organizations or people like UN or SCAP to link government, Thai government together, and a public-private partnership that needs to go through some foundations. But this is one of the things that I think the Digital Asia Hub can help with. If you have data sources, if you know people who wants the same thing or a government service that has the same project, maybe can contact me and link us up a little bit. Or even case studies from abroad, because success story is always a good start when you talk to government.
I think one other role that we can play is working across disciplines. I think technologists talk to each other, policymakers talk to each other, the humanities don't get to talk to anyone. So I think integrating the conversations, because I think some of the problems we're dealing with are so intractable or so complex, no one discipline is going to come up with the solution. Or if it comes up with the solution, there's going to be a human rights implication. If there's a legal solution, there's a technical reason it's not going to work. So I think one of the roles we can play is actually bridging those conversations, being a sort of intermediary, helping, to translate things. We like writing long academic articles that nobody will read, but I think even saying, if we're actually translating this for a policymaker who has 30 seconds to read 3 key points, what does that look like? And, coming up with digestible, accessible information, and also working with, I think there's no lack of standards in this space. Ethics is now a big deal, and they're like, previously you had no idea of ethics, and now there are like 400 ways of looking at ethics and AI. So even helping to parse, what are all the different resources out there, what might work best for your field, connecting you to people in that space. So I think, those are building capacity within civil society who might not actually be dealing with these issues and the technology, but are on the forefront of recognizing its impact and consequences amongst the populations that they work with. So I think connecting all of those people is a really, really valuable function that we hope we can play a small role in.
Great. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Malavika and Tirani for such a great conversation. And let me now introduce my colleague Jenna Sherman at the Berkman Klein Center. She is a senior project coordinator and very deeply involved in all the work that the Berkman Klein Center is doing on the ethical and governance questions related to AI, and she will be moderating the next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amr. And also for that last question, which really framed this next session really nicely, where we'll be taking a couple steps back to think more broadly about global AI governance. And you really did the work for me in setting up that stage. So if I could please, in the spirit of moving towards a broader discussion on global governance, bring up Dr. Urs Gasser, who is the executive director of the Berkman Klein Center, and Dr. Akarit Sungpat, please, who is at CMLK. Thank you so much. As I mentioned, we are going to be moving from the more granular approach to thinking of AI and its impacts, particularly in that session in the public sector, to a broader discussion on global AI governance.
And it's really helpful, I think, to have set the stage at that more narrow perspective, because especially given the complexities of AI, it's often easy to get lost. And I think that the higher level picture when you start there from the beginning, so especially getting some of those definitional groundworks laid down and hearing about some of the ways that AI is actually playing out in a variety of contexts will be really helpful in thinking about the ways in which we can bridge regional approaches to AI and create really robust frameworks that aren't just benefiting one region of the world over another or that don't have any contextual nuance. So I'm really pleased that we have here with us both Dr. Urs Gasser and Dr. Akarit Sangpet, who both come with a really strong background, not only in the field of AI, but also other emerging technologies, which is also going to be a really beneficial perspective to have in thinking about how we can piggyback off of former models of regulating emerging technologies and think towards how we can promote new ones. And I think this conversation is particularly important, as was very clearly demonstrated in the previous session, given how rapidly the AI technologies are advancing and truly how slowly the rest of us are catching up, which has played out in some very notorious cases, I think, both on the negative end of how AI can impact society, and then of course also is already showing us the benefits that can be reaped when we harness these technologies for good. And I think it's also important to note that, as you really teed up well, Amr, in the last question of the session, how entities like the Digital Asia Hub Thailand can play these key convening roles in having a deeper understanding of governance models that are emerging and how we can really foster not only a strong global governance model, but also models that have true awareness of the local context as well. And I think that there's really three key ways that the Digital Asia Hub Thailand can help us promote better global governance models and ways in which we can learn from entities such as these and thinking through them. One of which is just promoting cross-cultural dialogue and getting folks around a table. As Tyranny really showed in the last session, when we silo our information and when we silo our work, it makes it quite challenging actually to understand where other stakeholders and other sectors are coming from, and not only costs us a good amount of time and energy, but can end up resulting in true adverse consequences. So just getting people around the table is so important. And second is, in the same vein, getting work outside of the ivory tower and bringing it to the people who are actually impacted already by these technologies every day. And this isn't just the developers who are sitting around and spend a lot of their time thinking about and understanding these technologies and models, but also the people who are inadvertently affected by AI that don't always or often have a say in the ways in which they would like AI to impact them or not impact them, that is. That could also be an approach as well. And then third is really just improving and inspiring greater collective work and novel ways of approaching sound governance frameworks, and again, bringing people around the table to get an understanding of not only new ideas, but also what are some old ideas that we can repurpose. So with that, I want to turn it over to our speakers to give opening statements today on these issues. And first, Urs, I just want to ask if you could provide some key highlights of lessons learned from your work on the ethics and governance of artificial intelligence space, and particularly some key highlights of the state of play in AI globally right now.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Thank you, Jenna. Hi everyone, really delighted to be here. I tried to build a little bit on the previous panel and also link some of my observations back to the previous conversations. However, I will be a little bit more abstract, so there is a risk that we may get lost, as you put it, so bear with me for a moment. What I thought I could do is just to highlight 4 trends that I observe, again, from maybe also a comparative perspective with respect to AI governance and approaches to AI governance. The first trend I would like to highlight is, so far it seems, how we think about governance and how the law, in particular the legal system, responds to this new innovative technology and its applications, is essentially following past response patterns. So Herbert Burkert and I, we have done quite some work to analyze how does the law and governance systems more broadly respond if they're confronted with a new thing that seems at least new. And you see a couple of standard moves that lawyers make, and it already came up in the previous panel, by the way. The standard move is always you try to apply the old rules to the new phenomenon. So in this particular case, the default really is you try to figure out, you know, from a legal systems perspective, whether existing norms, be it data protection or cybersecurity requirements, or whatever it may be, can easily apply to the questions that arise in the application context of AI. And that's quite a process, so it requires some testing. Courts play a role, but of course also legal scholars play an important role. Government officials, you know, civil servants play an important role in trying to figure out, do the existing rules, are they enough or not? This testing out happens at various levels. It happens, of course, locally. Taking a great example in this context, self-driving cars, right? Where there's a lot of AI technology in self-driving cars. Now, many states, because it's regulated at the state level in the US, are figuring out currently, do we actually have to rewrite how we govern cars? And if so, how? And different states, and leaving aside different nations, have very different answers to that particular question. So this is a learning process, a testing out. And occasionally, of course, you decide you have to enact new rules, or you have sometimes also just to gradually adjust them and update them. So there are different ways how you can approach it. Now, at the regional level, we see some discussions right now around GDPR. Of course, GDPR was just entered into force, but there is a very robust discussion going on. Well, will GDPR be enough in a world of AI where the privacy risks, the data protection risks are of different sorts than the assumptions that inform the GDPR? So that's a regional conversation. An example, again, of this testing out, do we need new rules or are the old ones good enough, are happening also at the global level, at the level of the UN. Take the conversation that's happening these days about the regulation of autonomous weapon systems as a case in point, right? Where there's a question, do the old laws the old international norms that regulate the use of weapons, are they enough? Or do we need to upgrade them if machines make decisions in armed conflicts? So these experiences, this testing out and this kind of process to learn whether we can work with the old norms, whether we need to upgrade them or enact entirely new ones, that's a pattern we've seen with previous technologies. Whether you take the telegraph, the telephone, the internet, that pattern has played out before. I think that's trend number one, that essentially we're going through similar cycles as in previous technologies. The trend number two I want to highlight is we're talking a lot, and even in the introduction and framing for this session, about AI governance, and also we talk about frameworks. which somehow suggests, and I'm Swiss, so I'm compulsory in that way, that I love to draw frameworks and boxes and have clear structures. I think the truth of the matter is there is no such thing as a coherent AI governance framework. Rather, it will be messy. And we have indicators of this messiness if we look at the different norms that are either existing or emerging, as I just described, that regulate AI. Part of the reasons of this messiness is, as the previous panel so nicely demonstrated, that AI is not developed or applied in a vacuum. Take the health sector, or take the example of, road traffic transportation, or take the example of finance. These are regulated industries into which now AI-based technologies enter, and they not entering in a vacuum, as I just described. There's a lot of pre-existing norms that may play a role. And now, yes, granted, some of these norms have to be adjusted, but already the different sectors that are involved suggest it's very unlikely to have some sort of overarching AI law, a book that we can take off the shelf and have all the rules that govern AI. So that's one reason of the messiness. A second reason of the messiness is also going back to this learning process of what new norms may we need to enact. We see, and it was mentioned by Malavika towards the very end, we see now a flourishing of new proposals for standards and other types of norms that regulate certain aspects of AI. IEEE was mentioned, and we have two people who are, or more people even than two here in the audience, and I hope Brian and others can weigh in, that try to push forward certain standards with respect to the development of AI and good practices. But then you also have companies like Google coming up with their own company internal principles, how they think the development of AI should be governed within the company. And Lokman, who's formerly with Google, may have some critical perspectives on that topic later on as well. And so you have many companies coming up with norms, you have many standard organizations coming up with norms, you have different legislators around the world coming up with different norms, and so you will see a messiness of norms. And I would say one of the challenges going forward is how can we ensure somehow the working together, the interoperability across these different norm types, both within one jurisdiction, within one country or one region, but then also internationally. And so I feel we have not spent enough time and energy to think about the interfaces among different norm sources and norm types going forward. The third trend I wanted to share briefly is there's been a lot of discussion about norms, right? What types of principles should we have? What are the new rules that we should write, whether it's in health, whether it's in autonomous weapon systems? I gave a few examples, there are many more. What we haven't talked so much about is what are actually the accountability mechanisms. So in other words, it's one thing to say or to agree on what rules we should have, but then the other question will be how do we ensure accountability that companies or users are actually following these rules and that these rules are enforced. I feel that's a discussion that still lags behind. There are many reasons why that's the case. I just want to maybe mention three very quickly. One reason for the lagging behind of the accountability piece is that it's sometimes really hard to measure what AI is doing. So Lorraine, you already introduced yourself. I think there is a real measurement challenge and a tracking challenge to understand what's the impact of AI and what are the consequences in a given field of application. And so there's a whole discussion, do we need even to reimagining metrics for societal impact of AI. And I think without measuring, we will have a very hard time to introduce accountability because it remains somehow fluffy and embedded in context so that we are not able to pin down what the exact behavior and effect of an AI system was. A second reason why it's hard to talk about accountability and make progress, looking at the companies which play such the private sector that plays such an important role in developing these systems, you can see there is a natural incentive not to come up with very strong accountability schemes for many reasons that range from public relations consequences in the court of public opinion all the way to possible legal exposure and liability. So naturally there is a problem there. And last example in this category is also for the law, which could be, you know, if not the companies come up with robust accountability schemes, well, maybe the law should step in. But the law too has a little bit of a handicap because many of the traditional mechanisms that the law uses to introduce accountability also face certain barriers that are inherent to AI. And one of the great examples is, of course, that law, more often than not, also it has developed ways around it, presumes that you can explain the behavior after the facts. And with some of the AI-based systems, this problem of explainability comes up that makes it very hard for the law to really step in and assign accountability based on traditional mechanisms. So that's definitely an area where we need more innovative thinking within law. Okay. Fourth and last trend is taking even a bit of a higher altitude. Despite all these different norm sets and these different differences in approaches, I feel there are at least roughly 3 ways how to think about AI governance globally. One approach is the US approach, and I will be very crude in my description of the US approach as well as the others, which is to say, let the innovation take place and we learn from the accidents. So it's essentially an approach to governance that is roughly modeled after what we've seen in the airline industry, where the philosophy is, well, you know, there's lots of good stuff that a certain technology brings to society. Yes, there will be accidents, but the key is not to try to prevent too much the accidents, but really learn from the accidents and then incorporate the learnings into best practices. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but just as a mental picture, learn from the accidents, US approach. There's a second approach, which is the European approach, and I can say that since I'm European. That's the precautionary principles, which is citizen first. We don't want to be the first one in technology development or deployment. We want to make sure whatever we do is good for the citizens. And the discussions about GDPR, I think, are really some sort of symptomatic of that approach, but also all the ethics panels and committees and the national expressed even in the national strategies that we see now across Europe are a good illustration of this precautionary approach to say, okay, we don't need to be the first ones, but we want to get it right. Then I would argue there's a third approach, and that's the most challenging to talk about, which is the Chinese approach. And I think within the Chinese approach, you see another facet of AI technology, which wasn't mentioned in the previous panel, and that's really the notion of power, how AI actually has a potential to shape power relationships not only at the global level, but also between government and citizen. And I think in China we have a very complicated story to unpack in how the government thinks about some of these potentials, but also risks that are introduced to its own internal power structure currently. So three very different models. Now, the last point I want to make within that trend of 3 emerging models is that there may be a fourth way. And that's where I would like to loop it back all the way to Malavika's introductory remark. I do think a fourth way of looking at AI governance may emerge from countries other than, or regions other than the US, Europe, or China, and may very well come from places like Thailand, may very well also come from countries in Latin America. And that makes me very excited to engage in efforts like the Digital Asia Hub and in several others, because I truly believe the next insight and the next cycle of innovation for new governance models and mechanisms may well be grounded in different social practices and in different institutional arrangements in this part of the world. So with that, I turn over to you, and I hope we didn't get totally lost given the abstract level of the remarks.
Thank you so much, Urs. Not too abstract at all. In fact, I'm grateful for your ability to both illustrate our shortcomings while simultaneously pointing out areas where we can really make significant improvements. And I just have a quick two-pronged follow-up question related to your points. One is essentially like what your thinking is on how we can do a better job about thinking both globally and locally and bridging some of the heterogeneity and norms that you're talking about. I know, for instance, we've discussed before about the risk of these three models being some of the more significant ones, and other, especially smaller countries with more developing economies, following those specific ones, further polarizing our efforts. How can we better promote, I think, like local thinking and innovation, and also governance models that work in both specific contexts and also like fit maybe not nicely, especially given the clear messiness that ensues with when we try to regulate AI, but do fit into a broader, more robust governance system. So that's the first part. And then the second is what your thinking is on how we can do a better job at bringing AI thinking to models that already exist, which you alluded to already. So how can we, not silo AI in another way into its own regulatory system, but when we think about broadband, how do we incorporate the new challenges, the new opportunities for AI when we think about cars and, of course, autonomous vehicles? When we think about data and data access, how can we, I think, focus on using the existing models, not necessarily to regulate AI across the board, but start that process, I think, of where there are currently gaps.
These are hard questions, and I want to be very brief because we have much more to discuss. I would say with the first question, I don't think I would start with governance. I would start with innovation, and I believe that, for instance, also what ETDA is currently working on to build local ecosystems for entrepreneurship, or what we heard in the previous panel, how we work with government officials and build bridges between academia to showcase how you can use technology for the social good. That's definitely a starting place. I would add to that law, and you mentioned that in your remarks, can play also an enabling role because law, maybe more often than not, can be a unhelpful barrier to overcome so that we can unlock some of the potential that AI can bring to us because there may be interoperability barriers, because there may be data sharing barriers, even in cases where we can demonstrate that there is a lot of good that could happen. So there is a link to governance, but it would definitely not be my starting point. I would also add there are many more ideas, and we, for those who are interested on these issues, we hosted a big symposium last year on AI and inclusion, where we started to collect with our friends from around the world some of the examples how you can make progress in building local ecosystems and use also policy tools to enable data sharing. So there's a rich conversation, and I'm happy to chat more about that off the record. Your second question, well, it reminded me of something else than you asked, which is there is also now a trend to look at AI itself as some sort of a system that affects the law and could even absorb the law. So there is now a discussion going on, can we basically build law into the autonomous systems themselves? So if law, in other words, have a hard time to regulate AI, can we make AI so smart that AI knows what the law requires and actually also immediately enforces that law in a very granular way? That's an interesting trend that would somehow be the perfect synthesis between law and technology. It's a perfect synthesis that scares me a lot because I don't see yet how actually hundreds and hundreds of years of institution building can be replaced through technology, if you particularly think about the rule of law in its many facets as a guarantee and a safeguard for human autonomy and dignity. But that was just kind of a slight detour to avoid a lengthy answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And in that same vein of thinking both locally and globally, Dr. Akarit Sangpet, I would be grateful if you could give some perspectives on the current state of play of AI in Thailand, and also from a comparative perspective, especially considering that you wear many different hats here. You have a tech background, you also work in academia. Now it seems like you're foraying more into policy. So given that you yourself are an example of bridging different sectors, I'd be really curious to hear what your thinking is on how AI is emerging in Thailand.
All right, thank you so much. So, hi everyone. So, it's a great opportunity to be here. I'm actually, for the last panel, I'm actually one of the junior professors here. And this is actually my 5th year in Thailand. So in a way, we kind of still adjusting. But anyway, last year, we got a chance to run this project we call the Smart City Innovation Hub. It's one of the projects that we got about 32 universities in Thailand, try to work together on building up on the research regarding the smart cities. And I get into it, how this is related to AI. The thing is, one of the challenges, as the previous panels suggest, is actually how to actually get people to work together, right? And I think getting professors to work together is also one of the very nice challenge I have experienced. Not to mention, we also need to work with the government, local government, and also some of the agencies as well. And so, in order to do that, for Thailand, I think comparing to the States, if we compare in terms of the human resources, we are very much lacking so many people to actually get this to happen, just the technology itself. In a way, we're trying to catch up, but there's also an advantage, right? In a sense that we don't really need to start from the beginning, right? We can leverage up on the years of experience, right? But even then, so getting people to work together is actually I think it should be one of the roles that the governance can actually play, right? So Thai law is, I'm not sure, very interesting in a sense that we got a lot of government agencies, and basically all of them have its own law, and some of them actually have some law that actually affect other agencies. So there's a lot of different issues. So that's actually, I think, why when the Minister of Digital Economy tried to gather the information from the other ministers also have their own regulations. You cannot really go past that. So somehow we need to figure out a way to share or affect the other people's law. To be honest, I mean, Thailand, I think ETDA, if you consider itself, I think we already have the Electronic Transaction Digital Act since 2001. It's been 17 years. All government can actually have electronic paper. We can have digital information. Right there, back then, 17 years ago. the fact of the matter is, as you suggested, we have institutionalized for like very, very long history, and the people are still using papers. So we cannot even begin the AI phase just because we cannot even have the data. I remember using with some of the NC and I asked them for information, you have this information, and they said, I have a lot of information. So what happened is basically he started and go out and say, okay, this is the folder, you can go and start with that. We cannot start AI research with that. So I think one of the things we have is actually we should have this supportive regulation to have. I also have another thing to share about like the entity that I'm here right now. We can pass that for another session. So I think that's one of the key things we actually need. And the other thing to build on Earth's suggestions is actually the accountability of the person making the AI itself. So one of the things is having computer compute it for you. Most of the question becomes, okay, who's take the fault, right? If it were like autonomous car, you could say it's very serious enough. But what about the transparency in some of the domains we have that you might not think it's really that serious? It doesn't affect life and death, but it's very important. For example, like banking, right? You know, if the bank start to give out loan, what do they base on? For the AI algorithm, based on the data they have, but what if they based on the data they have? What if the algorithm itself has the bias, right? That is a challenge. We also need to figure out how to do that. And I think if we have some of the general framework that can address this from the legal point of view, it's actually kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that it can it's also a barrier to innovation in a way. Right? If some of the startup want to do something very great thing and they need to follow all this regulation, which by the way, that is our law, usually. But also, we also needed to make sure that people have equal access or equal treatment from the mostly the institutional that actually employ AI in their work. Like some other things, like what happened for the hirings, right? So what happened if I'm a college, I'm start doing admissions based on not just plain statistics, but you based on a lot of things, asking some questions, what if you have inadvertent bias? So how could we deal with that? So unless we can actually make some of these algorithms transparent, and as you also suggested, if we can even incorporate some of the law into the algorithm itself, right? Then we don't really need to worry about the law itself anymore because we just ingrain it with the computing, right? So I mean, should we have the cyber law and should we have the real world law and make sure it's getting together, right? And one of the last thing I think we need to concern is about the privacy. The GPDR is a really interesting example in a way that one of the regulation actually affect, how come it affect the entire world? I'm not quite sure about that, right? But that's also a very important thing in a sense that when we start using this AI is based on the data. And then the way we treat with the data, how do we actually make sure that everybody get treated fairly, equally, but also how could you prevent the data from being leaked? How could you make sure that who's actually using your data, right? Or is there a way that, I mean, this is more of the technical point of view, right? I mean, if there's a way you can invent some of the algorithm that can actually provide these capabilities, which is already hard enough, but without having to actually take a look at the raw data, but still be able to make some of the statistical analysis making sense. So I mean, there's a whole field of differential privacy, right? Just to make sure that you can actually do that. So I think there's a multiple fronts that we actually need to address. So I think I leave that for now. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Songpet. I really appreciate it. And it's especially interesting hearing how a few of the recommendations you're speaking to can overlap and enable one another. So for instance, bringing different stakeholders together can help promote better global governance models, as you're saying, and simultaneously can help address issues like privacy and like biased algorithms when more diversified voices are around the table. And just as a really quick follow-up, I'm wondering what initiatives you've seen working in the Thai context to address some of these solutions that you see viable, or at least like in going forward as possible solutions. You know, for instance, Tierney spoke to education efforts on really bridging different sectors, and I'm wondering if you know that specifically is like one model that you see working, and you know, in the same vein, how we can get these technological solutions like differential privacy and other safeguards as a you know more standard practice when developing these technologies.
So I could speak from mostly for the local context. Say for Thailand, we are I think we are very unique, interesting cultures. You can see Thai people are very friendly, but in a way, I think we are very risk averse, in the sense that our law actually lies toward the side of the taking all the precautions, right, to make sure it's okay. So much that if the thing doesn't actually get written in the law, people will actually not do it because they were afraid that it might violating something else. Because as I said, even if you take out one bill of the law, right, and you said, okay, there's no restriction in this one, you actually don't know what happened to the 1,000 bills that you're not gonna violate. So that's on the caution side. So especially for the people in the public sector, we actually have a lot of issue with that. So much so that I think it just only happened for this government. So if you said one thing, if this working, which is a very interesting thing, is this: we have this thing called Article 44, which basically the administrative can actually draft up a new law in the way whatever they want, right? To make sure that you can actually clear up this part, right? And I'm actually one of the organization I'm working right now. I actually got a benefit from that. So CMKL University, which is actually with a collaboration between the Carnegie Mellon University. I'm actually graduate from there, and the King Mongkut Institute of Technology, Lat Krabang. So that's one of the largest engineering school in Thailand. So the way it works is actually we try to setting a new education program, engineering education, to make sure we build up all the high-end capacity we need here in Thailand, right? But from the educational point of view, we got so many restrictions in the regulations. Just for the educational Minister of Education itself, it's only one government unit. We have like 14 others, right? And that you cannot actually satisfy the CMU degree. If you satisfy Carnegie Mellon degree, you actually won't be able to satisfy the Thai degree requirement, which in a way our minister thinks is really funny. So the government say, okay, if they actually want this thing to happen, they actually need to set up draft up a new regulations, right? To make sure that, okay, this thing can actually happen. And basically what this thing said is forget whatever the existing regulation and just use this one. So I don't know whether some other system can actually do that, but I think this is something we kind of temporarily be able to do for now. But I mean, with that, it actually enables a lot of collaborations, and we can actually have this organization set up and get it running. But that's one other thing. But the other thing we need is actually, it's very important, as Malika suggested, is the people, right? After all, I think the law itself won't gonna be able to give anyone success. We can draft up the best law and the best procedures. But I mean, if the mindset of the people, they are not collaborative, they are not cooperative, this is not happening, right? So usually it's really hard to get the collaboration from other competing people, right? But for our last year project, we were able to get all the data for the PI. Just so that, just basically because, you know, when people actually talk and when they get to know each other, they are more willing to try to figure out a way to make sure it works, right? But I mean, if you don't really care, you will say that, okay, I don't know you, why should I lift a finger? And the first thing we're going to say is, this is not doable, which is a matter of fact. I think like most of the regulation I hit was basically, you can actually do a lot of things, they just don't willing to do it. So I think it's also important that like, if we have a law, how could we have some governance? I wouldn't say a law, but it's more like the governance framework that actually allow people, we need to set up environment that allow people to be like a bit more collaborative, and that they can actually figure something else. Right?
Thank you so much, Dr. Songput, and of course to you, Dr. Gasser. It's really helpful to hear both about the global and local Thai perspective, given where we are today. And I could certainly exhaust my questions for you both, but I'm really keen to turn it over to the participants in the room. And building off of some of the observations and recommendations from our two input statement providers, I'm wondering if you all could speak some to what the key takeaways on the emergence of AI has been over the past year, and what has been done already, what is yet to be done, especially in addressing challenges from the perspectives of your respective areas of work. And of course, you're also welcome to ask direct questions as well, but I really want to encourage interactivity and dialogue between everyone in the room. So, oops, sorry.
Thank you, Jonah. Just a very brief remark on the relationship between artificial intelligence and law and artificial intelligence. In the 18th century, a machine came up that could play check. It's the so-called Czech Turk, because it looked like a Turkish man and was playing chess. And there was a long discussion in Europe and in the United States whether this is a machine or whether there is someone inside the machine. Edgar Allan Poe did a very interesting analysis to find out or to answer this question by saying it's a machine. It's a person inside, sorry. And in Europe, there was a writer who commented on that, and he actually used the term artificial intelligence. And he wrote that if artificial intelligence is ever to replace natural intelligence, lawyers don't have to fear anything.
My name is Li Hui. I'm from China, Shanghai. When we talk about the governance of AI, my question is about the relationship between the big AI company and the government. As a big company just get more and more data, and we don't know their we don't know what they do with the data. So like the professor just mentioned, let the innovation take place, we learn from the accident. But in China, in the past 3 months, we have 2 bad accidents. So my question is, in China, the public just criticize the big AI company. We said it's maybe because of the company. But my question is, what's the role of the government in the accident? What the role of the big AI company? So this is my question.
So I obviously can't comment on the specific cases you're referring to. I'm not familiar enough with the local circumstances, but I do believe there is an interesting new dynamic at play as how essentially AI becomes a crystallization point to rethink and at times also challenge and criticize the relationship between government and companies that actually in the technology space for decades has been highly symbiotic. take the example of the US. There's a lot of scholarship describing how actually the development, particularly of digital technologies, but also before, how the relationship between governments and the private sector was actually a mutually beneficial relationship. And I do think we have precursors now for a number of reasons that this relationship gets much more complicated. Obviously, the Snowden revelations were some sort of a starting point of the public awareness of what are some of the downsides if governments and companies start to work to use some of these relationships in a way that may not align with societal norms. If you look at some of the stories, what's happening now within large US tech companies, where employees stand up and say, you know what, I don't want my company to develop surveillance systems that can be used by the governments, or I don't want my company to produce kind of systems that can be deployed as weapons, autonomous weapon systems. So it's very interesting in the US for sure that you now have a much more open and also kind of more controversial discussion within companies, but then also across the stakeholders, of course, how this relationship should look like between AI tech companies and the government going forward. And I think it's just the beginning. On the other hand side, of course, it's also a reality to say you have geopolitical interests. So it's one thing if the US tech companies are wrestling internally what's the right thing to do vis-a-vis the Pentagon, let's say. But at the same time, of course, it's also a reality that the collaboration or the exchange of knowledge and research and technology development between the private sector and the government will be a key strategic factor in geopolitical terms, whether you look at the economy or if you look at national security. And that adds yet another layer of complexity as we try to figure out what are these new dynamics. So I think you touched upon a very challenging point that will get more and more complicated, and I would be eager to hear your thoughts on the situation in China, but I know we have cocktails thereafter, and maybe that's the better place to discuss this.
Yeah. I think that brings up some very good point. Some of the region that has a very good symbiotic relationship between the government and the big company, especially the big company, right? Actually, I think it's not that different here in Thailand. But I think it's important that that's actually exactly why we also need check and balance. So, and also I think academia is also one of the key players that actually can step up and at least either in the role of the facilitator. Because usually, like, if you were in one of the organizations for too long, nobody gonna listen to you, right? So once you bring in the third eye, and then more likely they are actually gonna listen, right? And from the new perspective, and also as academia, we can actually contribute in a way that you can actually do actual research on what happens with the data or what happens with the incidents. What should be the case, right? So I think it is important that we actually need all the parties involved and not just focusing on a few.
Thank you very much for the two presenters. My name is Evelyn and I'm from the UNDP. I'd like to hear from you. What do you think will be the role of multilateral institutions, especially on these issues of governance? Is there a law, is there a law that they should, or is there a discussion that we should begin to have, and maybe moving out of what we've always pursued in terms of rule of law, democracy and things, but needing more focused on the governance of AI going forward?
I'm happy to share a quick thought, and again, it also goes back a little bit to what's most needed. And at the current stage, I find it, yes, super important to think about and to explore these very challenging governance questions and what should be the ethical rules and so forth. And definitely the international systems, the international institutions are key stakeholders in these debates, are also conveners of these debates. That being said, perhaps the most productive role for now, I see much more when it comes to international institutions, especially the UN system, is with respect to how can AI be used to bolster and pursue the sustainable development goals. And I think it's a very, I know you're working on climate issues and the like. There is tremendous potential, positive potential of the use of AI-based technologies in many of these areas. And to me, to think about how can we ensure and what role can international organizations play in concert with national governments to ensure that this technology is used to the benefit of all people across the world, and not only benefit those who are already living good lives, relatively speaking. That to me is the first order on the agenda, and I would say, yes, in parallel we need to have these hard conversations about the global rules and global norms, and that's happening already, but I think there is much good we can do, and where we can probably make more progress with every inch of energy we put into our time to meet and talk.
Yeah. For me, I think the discussion we should have, I mean, at least from the local perspective, is we actually need to figure out a way to make all this system actually interoperable. So that at least once you have the interop, you can actually, like, people can get access to data, or to verify something, or to verify like what's the results of the algorithms. The next one we actually need is the transparency. Right? So transparency and accountability. Like, can you actually open up the box and figuring out what happens? And then it might not be written in the law, but it's more likely that if you have some tools that we can actually verify that there's no bias or no hidden agenda working into these systems, I think that would be very important. And finally, probably also not in the law, but in the governance in general, how do you make this sustainable in terms of the entire ecosystem? How can you keep the innovation going while we still make sure that all the people are still benefiting from it, but not be taken advantage of by the one who actually collect everything?
I think you have an exciting project with Carnegie Mellon, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about the project, and especially the AI project that you might have with them, and and probably the impact on Thai business and society. Yeah.
So the projects we have with CMU is actually you can say a public-private partnership, right? So we have the local institution to make sure we have the people enough to actually got the technology transfer. We have the team at the Carnegie Mellon who perform like the advanced AI research. But the most important thing that actually CMU asks for this one is actually they actually need private partner. And that's actually very important. So we got very good private partners who are actually willing to, they need to transform themselves. Right? So we got some of the partner in the logistics company. So actually it's a beverage company, but it's also has a very big logistic operation, one of the largest in the regions actually. Amazingly, think about it this way: the entire planning is we're supposed to be really advanced, right? But as you suggested, a lot of companies actually have a history of running a really long legacy. So we got many people, right, working on this. But you could compare this, some of the largest company, you could compare as it's almost exactly like what we have with the public or the government institution, right? Where people used to do things one way, and it's really hard to have them do things the other ways around. We still have like 100 people trying to solve something this algorithm can actually run within a second, right? So that's actually some of the things we try to work on. So they actually got developed the technology, like, so they actually have the teams to do it. It's a very advanced team to do the data collection and everything. But we actually have CMU helping in terms of like how can we actually improve the process. But our organization themselves, we're also trying to help them figuring out like how can we adapt the people, right? How can you actually transform the company to make sure that we enter into this AI era and we are actually equipped, and they want to be still in the leading edge of the company. So I think that's one of the most exciting projects we are doing. We also have other IoT and agricultural projects as well, right? So we try to explore different things, right? And in addition, we also have to work with ETDA in terms of how we can actually work with to improve the digital privacy and how to investigate like in the forensics part of it. Thank you.
So Dr. Sangpet spoke of convincing people to change their ways, I think, and really adopting and being willing to adopt new innovative processes. And I think a key tenet of being able to do so is considering impact. And when you have a specific impactful goal in mind, I think the work is much more likely to get done. And you spoke about sustainability, and Urs, you really aptly likened the potential of AI to supporting some of the large global goals that we've set, like the Sustainable Development Goals. And along those same lines, I'm wondering what members here think about impact metrics that can be used to indicate that AI is on the right track and that they will be able to contribute to some of the larger, more beneficial goals that we want them to, and simultaneously that we're mitigating the risks that could come about from these technologies as well. So I welcome any responses on the impact piece, if anyone has them, or if not, I'll turn it over, but I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts. Any thoughts from our panelists, Dr. Gasser and Dr. Sangpa? I don't mean to keep bringing it back to you, but
we will add it to the to-do list. No, but I think it's a really hard problem to solve, and you know, there is a big discussion happening across different fora. So the World Economic Forum has an entire group. I think IEEE also. Advocating we have been focused too much on GDP, not GDPR, on GDP as kind of a measurement of you know, doing well as an economy, and do we need some sort of new indices to measure well-being, as AI will radically change how we think also about the economy, but also the impact on society. So I think it's a very good question, and I feel we're only at the beginning to see in what directions we could go, and this will stay a long time with us. But Lokman and Lorraine may have thoughts.
This is a very good question, and I think it's at the forefront of what countries in the most developed economies in the OECD are trying to do. So at the OECD, we currently have a project called Going Digital, which is trying to look into the digitalization of the entire economy and society. And within this project, the mandate that we received from the member countries was to try to understand what are the information gaps that exist. So if you think about the issue that we don't even, I mean, we're at the beginning of the process of trying to understand what is the indicators that are necessary for digitalization, for AI. It's still right before that, really. So it's a challenge that all countries are having. But I think it's important to try to look into the issue of digitalization in a more holistic way. So we talked about trying to move AI from, or different ICT policies from a siloed approach. That's what we're trying to do with the project, trying to integrate taxation discussion, health, education, environment, public governance as well into a coherent framework. And this is very hard to do. I mean, if it's hard even within governments to have a coherent approach for this, for organizations such as the OECD, it only reflects that, trying to match and build a common vocabulary across different policy areas. That's a big challenge, but it's a task that our members have passed on to us, and it's quite a monstrous one. It's a very challenging one as well.
Hi, I'm Lockman from the Digital Asia Hub and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I think the question about impact is really interesting, and we obviously need to measure the impact. One way to think about it beyond GDP is also sort of not just in terms of like what's going well, but also like how, like what's the cost of innovation and AI and developing that. And then so one thing we can think about is something we haven't really talked about, but sort of on the edges of it, is trust as a sort of like a basic, unit of society. And we talk about transparency and accountability and so on. But how does, like sort of accelerating innovation, AI development and so on impact the trust people have in each other, the trust people have in government, the trust people have in companies? And anecdotally, what I see so far is that, like that is sort of like a zero-sum relationship, and that sort of is in the US, like in the governance models that Urs also sketches, sort of, there's an assumption in that, like it's either innovation or, like harm in certain things, right? And when you talk about the impact, like I don't think we realize that this is not a neutral, when we do AI, it's not a neutral process, right? When we collect data, we forget that data is people. Like we talk about data, and we forget, like we're actually really talking about people. And I thought it was interesting how Urs and both the panelists were talking about sort of a pushback or a resistance to some of these developments, right? So Urs talks about the workers at specific tech companies and how they're now resisting development of certain technologies to be used in certain ways or being appropriated for certain uses. What's interesting, I think, is like how people, like and you talk about sort of how Thai people are a little bit more sort of inhibited in their behavior, right? Like and sort of reluctant to do certain things and other things, right? Like when you collect data from people, like people will know that, right? And if the data is going to be beneficial to not the people themselves back in the long run, but government and markets and companies, right? And I think we sort of need to start measure trust as a way of impact of AI as well.
Thank you so much. We'll take one last comment.
I think this was discussed, I don't know, probably in the earlier panel. One way to measure impact is conformity assessment in a very narrow view. And if you are able to develop some kind of an assessment scheme that designers or product developers, and I think IEEE 7000 is doing that, and if you have the ability to measure whether they are conforming to certain principles or guidelines that they discussed of what the AI machine will do and will not do, I think that will go back to the trust issue, if you are able to come up with such a scheme.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your really thoughtful contributions. Unfortunately, we are at or just over time, actually, so I kindly ask you to help me in thanking both of our panelists and also all of you for being here and participating and bringing your presence and really thoughtful remarks. So thank you so much. With that, we are going to head out and be able to enjoy some refreshments and some snacks. But first, I was told that we had to redo the photos because Dr. Akarit was not yet here, which is great. We get multiple chances to look good, to look our best. So I just asked that the speakers and moderators come back up for one more photo, and everyone else can feel free to start heading out into the lobby area for the reception.
อยเท้าเอาไว้ให้โลกได้รับรู้ลองเปิดใจเรียนรู้เรื่องราวที่ยิ้มสู้ด้วยพลังเอ็ดดาที่ปัญหาจะฝ่าข้ามไปโลกที่แสนกว้างใหญ่มีไว้รอให้เราเชื่อมโยงด้วยกันก้าวต่อไปพวกเราก้าวต่อไปด้วยความเชื่อมั่นแม้ทางนั้นยังยาวไกลใจของเรายังเต็มไปด้วยพลังสร้างสรรค์ยั่งยืนเราช่วยกันวันที่ไร้ดาวอย่าปล่อยให้ใจเหน็บหนาวเพราะกลัวแสงไฟ